"You're my first," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking on the last word, heat rushing into her face so fast she couldn't stop it. "Since Robert. The first person I've wanted to—" She couldn't finish. Couldn't say the rest out loud in a lit kitchen with her hands shaking and her heart doing something she had no control over. Dylan didn't speak. He stood up slowly, moved around the table, and stopped in front of her. He took her face in both hands and looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had been trying to knock him down for 15 years. "And you'll be my last," he said. "That's not a pretty thing to say. That's a promise." If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The hoofbeats stopped. Evelyn didn't move from the table. She kept her hands flat on the wood, kept her eyes on that bank notice, kept her breathing as controlled as she could manage with her heart hammering the way it was. Samuel had gone still on the floor beside her feet, his little wooden horse clutched against his chest. His 4-year-old instincts telling him that whatever was happening outside was different from the usual kind of trouble. "Mama," he whispered. "Stay," she said. Not sharp, just final. She crossed to the door and lifted the rifle from the hook beside it before she even reached for the handle. That habit had taken her 6 months to build after Robert died. 6 months of waking up reaching for a man who wasn't there anymore before she finally accepted that reaching for the rifle was what would actually keep her alive. She opened the door. The man on horseback was backlit by a dying sun that turned everything at the edges of the yard into copper and shadow. He was tall in the saddle, not aggressive tall, just long, the kind of man who took up space without performing it. His horse was a dark bay, travel-worn, one shoe looking loose even from where Evelyn stood on the porch, with her rifle at her hip. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then the man took his hat off. Slow, deliberate, the same way his horse had come up the drive. "Not looking for trouble," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had learned to be careful over years of choosing words in situations where the wrong one got you killed. "Looking for water if you have it, and a meal if that's not too much to ask." Evelyn studied him. Dust on every surface of him. A bedroll behind the saddle that had seen serious weather. A rifle sheathed on the horse, but nothing drawn. Eyes that were, and she noticed this before she could stop herself, tired in a way that went beyond the road. Tired in a way she recognized because she saw it every morning in her own mirror. "Where are you coming from?" she asked. "East. That covers a lot of ground." "Yes, ma'am, it does." She didn't lower the rifle. "Where are you headed?" He was quiet for a beat too long. "Wherever work is." That pause. That one pause told her something she filed away without commenting on. A man who knows where he's going answers that question faster. "There's a trough at the side of the barn," she said finally. "Your horse can drink. You can fill your canteen from the pump after." "Appreciate it." "I didn't say you could stay." "No, ma'am, you didn't." He rode to the trough. She stayed on the porch and watched him dismount, watched him handle the horse. First, water check the shoes. Run a hand down both front legs before he did a single thing for himself. She noted that too. Samuel appeared at her hip. Somehow always at her hip when she needed him not to be. "Who is that?" he whispered. "Nobody yet," she said. She fed him on the porch, not inside. She was not stupid, and she was not sentimental, and she had a 4-year-old son inside that house, and she did not know this man from a stone in the road. Beans and cornbread. He ate like a man who hadn't eaten since morning, which she suspected was true, but he ate without rushing and without embarrassing himself, which told her something else. Manners don't survive everything a man goes through. When they survive, they're usually bone deep. "Dylan McCall," he said when he was done. He offered his hand. She shook it from a safe distance barely. "Evelyn Hart." "Hart," he repeated. "This is the Hart Ranch." "Was my husband's. Now it's mine." He didn't flinch at the past tense, didn't offer condolences she hadn't asked for, didn't make the usual face men made when they realized a woman was running a place alone, that particular combination of pity and calculation she'd grown to hate. He just nodded, like it was information, and nothing more. "How long has the well been dropping?" he asked. She stared at him. "What? Your trough water's good, but the pump pressure is low. You're drawing from a well that's seen no rain in a while, looks like. I'd say months." He looked at the ground, the way some men look at things they actually understand. "You need to dig it deeper or find a secondary source before midsummer, or you're going to have a serious problem." She had a serious problem. She had approximately 17 serious problems. The well was number 6 on that list. "I know," she said. "I can take a look at it if you want." "I said you could have water and a meal." "Yes, ma'am." He stood, picked up the empty plate, and held it out to her with both hands. "Thank you for that." She took the plate. He started for his horse. She told herself to let him go. She told herself that firmly and with complete conviction. "Mr. McCall." He stopped. "The barn's not much," she said. "There's a corner past the second stall that's dry. Your horse can stay in the first stall tonight if the shoe's as loose as it looks. I don't want it throwing on the road in the dark." She heard herself and wanted to stop, but didn't. "I'm not running a boarding house. One night." He turned around. In the last of the light, his face was something that would take her much longer to understand than one night. "I'll be gone before you're up," he said. He wasn't. She heard him before dawn. Rhythm of it came through the window, something being fixed, something being struck in even unhurried intervals. She lay still for a moment, listening to it, trying to decide if she was annoyed or something more complicated than that, and then she got up because she had cattle to check, and a son who would be awake in an hour and 20 things that wouldn't do themselves. She found him at the fence line along the east pasture. 3 rails she'd been propping with rope since March were replaced and set solid. He was working on a 4th without stopping when he heard her coming. "I said one night," she called. "I know what you said." He drove the last nail. "I'll be gone by noon." What is this? Fence was down, cattle'll drift. He straightened. "I noticed it yesterday. Couldn't leave it like that." She stood there feeling something she couldn't name and didn't particularly want to. "I don't have money to pay you." "Didn't ask for any." "Then what do you want?" He looked at her, then directly, no evasion in it, and said, "I don't know yet." Then he picked up the tools and carried them back to her barn, like he knew exactly where they went, which he did, because he'd already spent one night studying the layout of her place, and that should have frightened her more than it did. Chapeau. By the time he'd fixed the fence, checked the loose shoe, replaced it with one from a box of spares. She didn't even know she had in the back of the barn repaired the hinge on the water trough gate and split 3 weeks' worth of wood. Before 10 in the morning, Evelyn Hart stood in the yard with her arms crossed and accepted a fact she found deeply inconvenient. This man was useful, not charming, not aggressive about proving himself. Just quiet and competent in a way that filled gaps she hadn't been able to fill alone, and watching it happen made something ache behind her sternum that she hadn't expected and absolutely did not have time for. "Noon," she said to him when he came back to return her tools. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you actually going to leave at noon?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you want me to?" She should have said yes. Any sensible widow in 1882 Texas with a 4-year-old and a failing ranch and a bank notice on her kitchen table should have said yes without hesitating. "The well needs digging," she heard herself say. "I can give you a week's meals and barn space." Dylan McCall looked at the ground, looked at the barn, looked at the distance in a way that she would come to recognize over the following weeks as the way he looked when he was measuring something internal. Some question he was putting to himself that he wasn't ready to say out loud. "I can stay a week," he said. He stayed 3, not because she asked him to extend it. She didn't. She was very careful not to. But each time the week turned over, something else on the ranch needed doing that she didn't have the hands for, and he was already there, and they had both developed the skill of not quite looking at the thing that was building between them. The well got deeper. The east fence held. The cattle stopped drifting, and Samuel Hart, 4 years old and entirely unconcerned with social convention, decided sometime in the second week that Dylan McCall was the most interesting person who had ever appeared in his world. It started with questions. Samuel had questions about everything in the universe at all times of day, and he usually asked them of his mother, who answered as many as she could before exhaustion took over. But Dylan was new. Dylan was different. Dylan also had the quality that made him exceptionally dangerous to a 4-year-old's developing attachment, he answered. Not with the distracted half-attention adults usually gave small children. He actually stopped what he was doing and answered. Fully, carefully, like the question mattered. Why do horses sleep standing up? Dylan had set down the harness he was oiling. Because horses are prey animals. They need to be able to run fast if something comes after them. If they're lying down, it takes too long to get up. Samuel had considered this with tremendous gravity. Are we prey animals? People. Dylan looked at him sideways. Not exactly, but we're not so different from horses sometimes. We need to be able to move when we have to. Samuel had nodded like this confirmed something he'd been working out for a while. Do you always have to move? That question landed differently than the others. Evelyn, who had been pretending to organize harness hooks 2 feet away, felt the whole air in the barn change. Dylan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. I used to think so. Because of something chasing you. He looked at Samuel for a long moment. Yeah, he said. Something like that. Samuel nodded again, completely satisfied with this, picked up a piece of straw, and went back to whatever elaborate game he'd been playing. Dylan went back to the harness. Evelyn stayed very still until she was sure she could move without her face betraying anything. 3 weeks and the first real trouble arrived. Not the bank. Not yet. The bank sent paper. This arrived on 2 legs with a hat and a suit that cost more than anything Evelyn owned, and it drove up in a buggy that hadn't seen dirt roads before this particular errand. Elijah Morse. She knew who he was before he introduced himself. The bank agent she'd been hearing about all spring, the one who'd been working the county, visiting failing properties, making offers that sounded like help and functioned like traps. Dylan was at the well when Morse arrived. She didn't call him over. She met Morse on the porch alone the way she'd been meeting every piece of trouble that came her way. Mrs. Hart. Morse tipped his hat with a smile that had been practiced until it looked natural. I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, she said. What do you want? The smile held. He was the kind of man who'd trained his smile to hold. I represent Consolidated Western Land, Mrs. Hart, working alongside the First National Bank of Hardin County. I'm here because we understand you may be experiencing some financial difficulty, and we'd like to offer you a solution. The bank's solution is to buy my land. To purchase it at fair market value, yes. He reached into his coat and produced a document folded and official-looking. Given the current drought conditions and the state of the cattle market, I think you'll find our offer quite generous. She didn't take the paper. I'm not selling. Mrs. Hart. My husband built this ranch. My son is going to grow up on this ranch. I am not selling it. Morse let the paper drop to his side. The smile shifted, not gone, just recalibrated. I understand the emotional attachment, truly. But a woman alone with a young child carrying a mortgage with payments past due, the compassionate thing, Mrs. Hart, the realistic thing would be to consider your options before you have no options left. I have options, she said, not ones that interest you. And what options are those? Not unfriendly, just precise. The kind of precision that wasn't really asking. Good morning, Mr. Morse. His eyes moved past her shoulder. She didn't turn. She knew by the shift in Morse's expression that Dylan had come up behind her, not aggressive about it, just there, in the way that large, quiet men can suddenly fill a space and change its nature entirely. I don't believe we've met, Morse said. No, Dylan said. We haven't. A beat of silence that wasn't comfortable for at least one of the 3 of them. Morse put the paper back in his coat. The practiced smile came back, but thinner than before. Think about it, Mrs. Hart. The offer has a timeline. I'll be back. He tipped his hat. Good day to you both. They watched the buggy turn out of the yard. Evelyn crossed her arms. I didn't need you for that. I know you didn't, Dylan said. Then why? Because he needed to see you didn't have to. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road where Morse's buggy had disappeared, and his jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Something underneath the usual quiet that was harder and older. You know men like that, she said. It wasn't a question. He was a long moment answering. I've seen how they operate, he said finally. They come with paper first. They come with something else later. How much later? He looked at her then. Depends on how much you push back. She held his gaze. I'm going to push back. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the thing that lives next to one. Yeah, he said. I figured. The talk started in town that same week. She knew it would. She'd known the moment she told Dylan he could stay in the barn that the talk would come, and it came exactly as she'd predicted. In lowered voices at the general store, in a particular look from the minister's wife on Sunday, in a comment from her nearest neighbor Harriet Pruitt that was phrased as concern and functioned as judgment. People are saying things, Evelyn. People have always said things about me. This is different. A woman in your position with a man living on the property. He's a ranch hand. He works for room and board. He's a strange man. Nobody knows him. I know enough, Evelyn said. Harriet's face tightened. Where does he come from? Where has he been? What kind of man drifts through the county with nothing and nobody? Evelyn looked at her neighbor steadily. The kind who needed somewhere to stop, she said. Same as most of us if we're being honest. She walked home carrying the weight of the town's opinion on her shoulders, the same way she carried everything else upright forward, one foot in front of the other, because there was no other direction available. But in the quiet of that night, when Samuel was asleep and the ranch was dark and the only sound was distant coyotes and the creak of the barn, she let herself ask the question Harriet had asked out loud. Who was Dylan McCall? She'd given a stranger access to her property, her barn, her daily life, her son's growing attachment. She had done this on instinct and necessity and the reading of small signs, the way he handled the horse first, the way he answered Samuel's questions, the way he'd stood behind her when Morse came not in front. She knew those things. She didn't know the rest. And the rest, she understood somewhere beneath her reasoning, was considerable. She asked him on a Thursday evening, which surprised them both. He'd come to return tools to the back of the barn and found her still at the work table doing accounts by lamplight, which he'd come to understand meant she was facing a number that didn't work out the way she needed it to. He set the tools down quietly and was about to leave when she spoke. Sit down, Mr. McCall. He sat. On the barrel across from her, the one Samuel used as a seat when he came to watch Dylan work. The lamp was between them, and in its light she could see the careful quality that settled over his face when he didn't know what was coming, a readiness that was almost military. That thought landed hard. I need to ask you something, she said. All right. And I need you to answer me honestly even if you think I won't like the answer. He said nothing, which she was learning meant yes. What are you running from? The lamp flame moved between them in a draft from somewhere. He watched it for a moment before he looked at her, and what she saw in his face when he did wasn't the deflection she'd half expected. It was something closer to acknowledgement, a man recognizing that a question he'd hoped to avoid had finally caught up with him. The war, he said, and things I did in it, and after it. She let the silence sit for a moment. What kinds of things? Not good ones. He said it without inflection, without drama, but with a flatness that was worse than either. I was a soldier. Then I was something else for a while. Things men pay other men to do when they don't want to do them themselves. His jaw worked. I stopped, but stopping doesn't erase it. Is anyone looking for you? Not anymore. A pause. Not that I know of. That's not the same as no. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him across the lamp. She had a 4-year-old son asleep in the house. She had a failing ranch, and a bank closing in, and a land agent who'd already come calling once. She had absolutely no surplus capacity for additional complications. She also had 3 weeks of evidence that this man was exactly what he appeared to be in all the ways that mattered for day-to-day survival on a property in trouble. That the fence was fixed. The well was deeper. The cattle were held. And her son, who had inherited his father's instinct for character, in the way that sometimes skips mothers entirely, had chosen this man as the safest presence in his small world. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. He blinked. Whatever response he'd been braced for, it hadn't been that one. "I'm not sending you away," she continued. "But I want you to understand that I have a son, and what happens on this ranch affects him. If something from your past is going to follow you here, I would leave before I let that happen," he said. Immediate. Clear. The only thing he'd said all night without a pause before it. She nodded. "All right then." She went back to her accounts. After a moment he stood. "Mrs. Hart." "Evelyn." Another pause, longer. "Evelyn." He said it once like he was learning the weight of it. "Thank you." She didn't look up from the numbers because if she had, she wasn't sure what her face would have done. "Good night, Mr. McCall." "Good night." He left. The lamp burned. The numbers on the page still didn't work out. But something else, something she had no mathematical system for, had shifted into a different column entirely. The letter from the bank arrived on the last Friday of the month. Formal language bank stationery, every word chosen to sound like procedure while functioning as threat. The mortgage payment was overdue. A second payment would be due in 60 days. Failure to satisfy both would initiate foreclosure proceedings at the bank's discretion. She read it twice at the kitchen table. Samuel was asleep. The house was quiet in the way that felt like pressure. She heard the barn door, heard his boots cross the yard, heard him stop on the porch, not knocking, just stopped, like he'd sensed something through the walls that told him this wasn't the moment to come in, and wasn't the moment to walk away either. She opened the door before he could decide. He looked at her face, then at the letter in her hand. "Bad news," he said. "The worst kind, the slow kind." He leaned against the doorframe. "How bad?" She handed him the letter. Watched him read it the way she'd learned to watch him do things carefully, all the way through, not jumping to the end. 60 days, he said. "For the second payment, which I don't have either." "What do you have?" She laughed, and it came out harder than she intended. "The land. The cattle, what's left of them. The determination of a woman who has nowhere else to go." He folded the letter, handed it back. His face was doing the calculation thing. She'd started to recognize that internal measuring that meant he was taking something seriously. "What if we drove the cattle to Abilene?" he said. "The eastern herd, the ones that have held on through the drought. 40 head is enough to make the drive worthwhile if the market's good. And the market right now, I know what the market is." She stared at him. "You'd do that?" "A cattle drive is 3 weeks minimum. I've done longer. With my cattle. On my behalf. With a wage," he said. "Something we'd agree on before we left. Fair share of the sale price." She looked at him for a long moment. 3 weeks on the road with this man and whatever hands she could hire. 3 weeks away from the ranch while it sat with only the barest crew to hold it. 3 weeks of possibility if the market held. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take your time." He pushed off the doorframe. "But not too much of it." He went back to the barn. She stood in the doorway holding the bank's letter and watching the dark and thinking about a man who kept finding new ways to be exactly what she needed him to be right at the moment she needed it most. She thought about the question Samuel had asked in the barn. "Did you ever love someone before?" And the silence that had answered. She pressed the letter against her chest and looked up at a sky full of stars over a piece of Texas that no bank had the right to take, and she made herself a promise in the dark that she had no idea yet how she was going to keep. She was not losing this ranch, and she was not going to let herself lose any more than that. She told him yes on a Sunday, not at the barn, not over accounts, not in any moment that felt arranged. She told him in the middle of the yard with Samuel on her hip and mud on her boots and the sun already punishing by 8 in the morning, because that was when the decision finished forming. And she had never been the kind of woman who waited for a better moment when the right one was already standing in front of her. "We drive the cattle," she said. 43 head, the ones that have held weight. I want to leave by Thursday." Dylan looked at her over the fence rail he'd been checking. "All right. I need 2 more hands minimum. I can ask the Pruitt boys, they've done drives before, they know this land." "The Pruitt boys are good," he said. "Ask them." "I'm telling you the plan, Mr. McCall, not asking your permission." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am. And I want 30% of the net sale. Not 20, 30. He was quiet for a beat. "That's fair." "I know it is." She shifted Samuel to her other hip. "We'll be gone 3 weeks minimum. I need someone to hold the ranch while we're out. Old Pete can manage the remaining stock if I leave him clear instructions." What about Samuel? She had thought about this more than she'd thought about the cattle or the money or the 3 weeks of road ahead. She had turned it over every night since she'd made the decision, and she had arrived at the only answer that made sense, and hated it and accepted it anyway. "He goes to Harriet Pruitt," she said. "She'll complain about it, and take him in anyway, because that's who Harriet is, underneath all the talking." Dylan nodded. He looked at Samuel, who was watching him with the absolute focused attention that 4-year-olds deployed when they understood something important was being discussed about them without being discussed with them. "How long?" Samuel asked. Dylan crouched down to his level without hesitating. 3 weeks, maybe a little more." "That's long?" "It is." "Are you coming back?" Dylan glanced up at her for just a fraction of a second, then back at Samuel. "That's the plan," he said. It wasn't the same as yes, and they both heard it, and Samuel seemed to accept it the way children accept hard truths when they're told them straight with something grave and quiet that was too old for his face. "Okay," Samuel said, and went back to the stick he'd been dragging through the dirt. Evelyn watched Dylan stand back up and felt something tighten in her chest that she absolutely did not have time to examine. "Thursday," she said, and walked inside. The Pruitt boys agreed. Clem and Holt, 19 and 22, big and loud and capable, in the way of young men who've grown up working land and haven't yet learned to be afraid of anything. They knew Dylan by sight from the 2 times he'd come to town with Evelyn for supplies, and they assessed him the way young men assess other men, with their chins slightly forward and their questions kept just below the surface. It was Clem who finally couldn't hold it. "Where'd you work before this?" he asked Dylan the evening before they left the 4 of them checking tack in the barn. "Different places," Dylan said. "What kind of places?" "The kind that needed work done." Holt grinned at his brother. "Real talkative, this one." "Holt," Evelyn said from the other end of the barn. "Just making conversation, Mrs. Hart." "Make it quieter." Dylan didn't look up from the harness he was checking, but something in the line of his shoulders told her he was almost amused, and that was its own small thing. She noticed and filed away. They left before dawn. Samuel was still at Harriet's. Evelyn had said goodbye the night before, because she knew if she did it in the morning, in the dark with the cattle moving around her, she would not hold herself together, and she needed to hold herself together for 3 weeks minimum, and she could not afford the luxury of coming apart at the start of it. She had knelt down to Samuel's level and held his face in both hands and said, "I am coming back. You understand me? I am coming back." He had looked at her with Robert's eyes, that particular shade of serious that she had fallen in love with in a grown man, and now saw every day in her son's small face, and said, "I know, Mama. Dylan said that's the plan." She had laughed, unexpected and sharp, and pulled him in and held him longer than she'd meant to. Now she was on horseback with 43 cattle moving ahead of her, and the Pruitt boys managing the flanks, and Dylan at the lead, and the sky was the dark blue that happens 20 minutes before first light, and the only direction that existed was forward. She rode. She had always been good at that. By the second day, the rhythm of the drive had established itself the way all hard work eventually does, not comfortable exactly, but known. The cattle set the pace set the hours stacked up and the miles fell behind them, and the conversation happened in the gaps between necessity. It was on the third night camp made, and coffee on that, Clem Pruitt said what everyone in Hardin County had been saying for 3 weeks and just hadn't said to her face yet. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Hart? You're going to whether I say yes or not." He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "What are you going to do if the drive doesn't bring enough? The bank people are saying Morse has done this before in other counties. That the offer is just the first step." Evelyn looked at the fire. "I know what Morse is." "What's the second step?" Holt asked. He was looking at Dylan when he said it, which told her the younger Pruitt had more sense than he generally showed. Dylan set down his coffee cup. "When the paper doesn't work," he said, "they find other ways to make a property difficult to hold." "What kind of other ways?" Clem asked. "Water rights disputes, livestock incidents that aren't accidents, the kind of pressure that's hard to prove but easy to feel." The fire crackled. The cattle settled in the dark beyond the firelight. "Has he started?" Holt asked, and this time he was looking at Evelyn. She thought about the section of east fence she'd found cut last week, the clean diagonal of a wire snip, rather than the ragged break of age or cattle pressure. She had told herself it could be anything. She had not entirely believed herself. "Maybe," she said. Dylan looked at her across the fire. She saw the thing in his face she'd seen when Morse drove away, that older, harder quality beneath the quiet. He had recognized Morse's type immediately, faster than she had, and she had wondered about that more than once in the weeks since. "Tell me the next time something happens on the property," he said. "Don't decide by yourself whether it matters." "I run that property myself." "I know you do." His voice didn't change. "Tell me anyway." She held his gaze for a long moment while the Pruitt boys looked very carefully at the fire and pretended to be elsewhere. "All right," she said. "Yeah, they hit trouble on the 6th day, and it had nothing to do with Morse. A section of Dry Creek crossing that the map showed as passable had become something considerably less passable after a storm system to the north they hadn't known about. The bank was swollen, the footing uncertain, and 43 cattle that had been moving steadily for 6 days were now planted at the edge of it with the collective opinion that they were not going across. Clem rode the bank looking for a better crossing. Holt tried pushing the lead steers from behind, which accomplished nothing but aggravated everyone. Evelyn watched the water and made calculations about time and distance and the cost of losing a day to find a safer ford. Dylan dismounted. "What are you doing?" she called. He was already in the water, knee-deep, walking it, testing the bottom with each step. She watched him cross to the middle stop, check the depth and the current, cross a little further, come back. "It's passable," he called back. "Rocky bottom, no sinkholes. The current's loud, but it's not deep enough to take them. They're just refusing because they can't see the other side clearly." "So what do we do?" "Take the first one across on a lead." He looked at her. "It'll go easier if you come with me." "Why me?" "Because they know you." He said it simply, no flattery in it. "They follow your horse better than they follow mine." She rode into the water without arguing further, because he was right, and there was no time to resent it. Together, they took the lead steer across her horse, steady his hand on the animal's halter, the water rushing around their legs, and the steer rolling its eyes and fighting every step and making it anyway. The first one across broke the resistance. The rest followed in a rush of noise and water, and the Pruitt boys shouting from the flanks. And in 10 minutes it was done, and they were on the other bank. And the crisis that had looked immovable had moved. She rode up beside him on the far bank, both of them wet to the knee, and the cattle streaming past them. "You've done a lot of drives," she said. "Some." "With your own cattle?" He was quiet for a moment. With someone else's. A long time ago. She didn't push it. She was learning which silences invited follow-up and which ones were closed rooms, and this was a closed room. But she noted the way he'd said it, someone else's, and the weight that sat underneath it. "Thank you," she said, "for the crossing." He looked at her sideways. "You would have figured it out." "Eventually," she agreed. But we didn't have eventually to spare. The Pruitt boys swept past them, whooping at the cattle young and loud, and entirely in their element. Dylan watched them with something that might have been recognition men who hadn't yet accumulated enough past to weigh them down. "How old are you?" she asked. He seemed slightly surprised by the question. 32. "You seem older." "War does that." "Which one?" "The one that did it to a lot of men," he said, and clicked his tongue at his horse and rode ahead to manage the lead cattle. And she let him go, because she could hear what that answer was telling her about how much it still cost him to carry. Abilene announced itself in dust and noise and the particular smell of a cattle town working at full volume. Evelyn had been there twice before with Robert, and the scale of it had startled her both times. The compression of commerce and livestock and humanity into streets that felt too narrow for all of it. The market was good, better than she'd let herself hope. She stood in the buyer's pen with Dylan beside her and her jaw set and her numbers memorized, and she negotiated with the kind of focus that came from having exactly one chance to get it right. The buyer, a thick man named Garfield, with small eyes, and the manner of someone who'd shorted more than a few sellers over the years, opened low. She countered without blinking. He made a face. She waited. He tried a different angle, the drought, the weight loss on the cattle, the market softness he was manufacturing from thin air. She told him the weight on every animal she was selling because she had checked it herself before they left, and she had a good memory for numbers. He blinked. She waited again. Dylan stood one step behind her and said nothing the entire time, which was exactly right, because she didn't need him to say anything, and the fact that he understood that was its own kind of support. Garfield settled at a number that was 82% of what she'd asked for. She took it because 82% was enough to cover both bank payments with something left over, and she knew when a deal was done. When they walked out of the pen, Dylan said, "You should have been a lawyer. Lawyers don't have cattle." She was doing the arithmetic in her head as she walked. "After your 30% and the Pruitt boys' wages and the supplies, I'll clear enough for both payments." "Barely." "Barely covers it," he said. "Barely covers it," she agreed. "Which is better than not." He looked at her. "You're not relieved." She stopped walking. He was right, she wasn't, and she hadn't understood why until he said it out loud. "Morse isn't going to stop," she said. "This pays the bank. It doesn't stop Morse. He wants the land, not the payments." Dylan was quiet. "No," he said. "It doesn't stop Morse. So in 60 days we're having the same conversation." "Maybe." He looked at the street ahead of them. "Or maybe we're having a different one." "What does that mean?" He turned to look at her directly, and in his eyes was the thing she'd been seeing in glimpses for weeks. Not calculation, not protection, but something closer to decision. Like a man who'd been telling himself he was passing through and had finally stopped believing it. "It means I'm not going anywhere," he said, "until this is resolved." She studied him for a long moment. Around them, the town moved and shouted and smelled like cattle and commerce and dust. "That could take a long time," she said. "I know." "You don't owe me that." "No," he said, "I don't." She understood the distinction, the not owing, the choosing anyway. She didn't know what to do with it, so she did what she always did with things she didn't know what to do with. She nodded once precisely and kept walking. But something in the center of her chest had shifted its weight. They were 3 days out from Abilene on the return, when Holt Pruitt came back from a scouting ride ahead with his face telling the story before his mouth could. "There's a rider been following us," he said. "Since yesterday at least, maybe longer, staying far enough back to look like coincidence." Evelyn felt the particular chill that wasn't weather. One rider, that I can see. She looked at Dylan. His face had gone to that military stillness she'd noticed before, all the surface expression organized downward, leaving something underneath that was very focused and not gentle. Describe him, Dylan said. Big, dark horse, coat even in this heat. Holt paused. Armed like he's expecting trouble. One rider tailing a cattle drive for a day and a half isn't coincidence, Clem said. No, Dylan said. It isn't. He looked at Evelyn. You carry that rifle loaded. Always. Keep it where you can reach it fast. He was already turning his horse. I'll ride back and get a look. Dylan. He stopped at his name. She hadn't used it directly before. It had always been Mr. McCall, or nothing at all. Don't ride back alone, she said. Something in his expression that was brief and then controlled. I'll take Holt. I'll go, Clem said. You stay with Mrs. Hart, Dylan said, in a tone that closed the discussion. He looked at Evelyn one more time, direct and steady. Keep moving. Don't stop for any reason. He and Holt rode back. Evelyn kept the cattle moving, Clem at her side, her hand near the rifle, the late afternoon sun making every shadow longer than it should be. 20 minutes that felt like an hour. Then hoofbeats behind them coming fast. She turned with her hand on the rifle stock and let the breath out when she saw it was Dylan and Holt, alone, no pursuit behind them. Dylan pulled up alongside her. He's gone. Veered off when we turned back. Who was he? Couldn't get close enough to make him. His jaw was set. But he wasn't curious. He was watching the route. Counting cattle maybe. Figuring distances. Morse, she said. Or someone who works for Morse. He rode even with her close enough that his voice was only for her. Evelyn, when we get back I want to look at that fence line you found cut. The whole east perimeter. She looked at him. You think it's already started? I think a man like Morse doesn't wait for bank deadlines, Dylan said. I think he runs multiple plays at the same time. The cattle moved ahead of them. The road stretched back toward Hardin County and the ranch and whatever was waiting there. He doesn't know what he's dealing with, she said. Dylan glanced at her sideways. No, he said. He doesn't. They rode into the Hart Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with the sale money secured, the cattle delivered, and a quiet between Evelyn and Dylan that was different from any quiet they'd had before. Not uncomfortable. Something more like a thing that had been unnamed for weeks and was now, without either of them having said it directly, understood. Old Pete met them at the gate with a face that immediately told her something had happened. What is it? She said, before she'd even dismounted. 3 things, Pete said. First, Samuel's fine, he's still at the Pruitts. Second, somebody moved your southern fence markers 2 nights ago. Whole section shifted 10 feet into your property, which would put your grazing line inside their claim if anyone bought that adjacent parcel. And third? She asked, though something in Pete's face told her the third was the one he'd been dreading saying. Third is there's a man waiting on the porch, Pete said. Been there since this morning. Says he's not from the bank. Says he's from a company I never heard of. He paused. He's got legal papers. Evelyn dismounted. She squared her shoulders. She looked at Dylan, who had already swung down and was standing with a stillness that said he was ready for whatever the next 10 minutes brought. Walk with me, she said. Not a request. He walked with her. The man on the porch stood up when they came into the yard. Young, thin, nervous in the way of someone who'd been sent to deliver something he'd rather not deliver, which was, she had learned exactly the kind of person who got sent on these errands. Mrs. Hart, he said. I represent Consolidated Western Land. I've been asked to deliver these documents. He held out an envelope with shaking hands that he was trying to hold steady. It's a legal notice of intent to dispute the property boundary on the eastern and southern sections of your holdings based on a survey commissioned by... I know who commissioned it, she said. She took the envelope, opened it, read it, felt the cold settle in her stomach. Dylan read it over her shoulder. She felt him go still in a way she'd learned to recognize as worse than visible anger. "This is a manufactured dispute," he said. Quiet, precise. "They commissioned their own survey, filed a claim based on it, and now they'll tie her up in county court for months while the bank deadlines keep coming." The young man swallowed. "I'm just delivering—" "I know what you're doing," Evelyn said. She folded the papers, looked at the man with a steadiness she had built out of 12 months of surviving things that should have broken her. "You go back to Elijah Morse, and you tell him that I received his papers. And you tell him that I will see him in court. And you tell him—" She paused and let the pause do its work, "that I am not a woman who runs out of fight." The young man nodded so fast it was almost a stumble. He was off the porch and on his horse and out of the yard before Dylan had moved. She stood on her porch holding the legal papers and looking at the land that was hers, the cracked, summer-baked land that she had poured every remaining piece of herself into for the past year. And she felt something settle in her that was neither hope nor despair, but something harder than both. "I need a lawyer," she said. "Yes," Dylan said. "A good one. Not the county kind. Someone who knows land law." "I know someone in Waco," he said. "We worked together, it was a long time ago, but he's good. The best I've seen at this kind of case." She turned to look at him. "You have a lawyer in Waco." "I have a lot of things from before," he said. "Not all of them are bad." For the first time since Pete had met them at the gate, she felt something that wasn't dread. It wasn't quite relief either. It was the feeling of a door she hadn't known existed opening a crack. "Write him," she said. "Tonight," Dylan said. She looked at him standing on her porch in the last light of the day, dusty from 3 weeks of road, and Abilene, and a tailing stranger, and a surveyor's dispute, and everything that was still coming, and she saw a man who had told her he was passing through, and had then spent every day since finding reasons to stay. She thought about Samuel's question in the barn, the question he'd aimed at Dylan like a small arrow finding its mark. Did you ever love someone before? And the silence that had said everything by saying nothing. She went inside before her face could say something she wasn't ready for either of them to hear. But she left the door open behind her. The letter to Waco went out the next morning. Dylan wrote it himself at the kitchen table by lamplight, while Evelyn put Samuel to bed in the next room. She could hear his voice through the wall, low and even answering questions. She couldn't make out the particular cadence of a man who had learned to talk to a small child the same way he talked to everyone else, straight, without talking down. Samuel's voice, then Dylan's, then quiet. She stood at the doorway of the kitchen and watched him write without him knowing she was watching, and she let herself do it for exactly as long as she could afford to before she stepped in and poured herself coffee and sat across from him like it was an ordinary thing. "Tell me about this lawyer," she said. Dylan set down the pen. "Thomas Reed. He was a judge advocate during the war, military law, land disputes, contract fraud. After the war, he set up in Waco. He has a reputation for taking cases other lawyers won't touch." "Why will he help you?" A pause. "I did something for him once, a long time ago. He told me if I ever needed anything." "What did you do?" He looked at her across the table. "Kept him alive," he said simply. "Long enough to get home." She held his gaze, the lamp between them, the letter half written on the table. "Does he know what you did after the war?" she asked. Dylan was quiet for a moment. "He knows some of it." "Will that be a problem?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "Thomas isn't a man who forgets what someone did for him because of what they did later." She nodded, drank her coffee, watched him finish the letter with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, each sentence considered, nothing wasted. When he folded it and sealed it, she said, "How long for a reply?" 2 weeks if we're lucky, 3 if we're not. "We have 60 days before the next bank deadline. The boundary dispute buys Morse time we don't have." "I know." He looked at the sealed letter. "That's why I told Thomas in the letter that we needed him yesterday." She almost smiled. Almost. "Go to sleep, Mr. McCall," she said. "We have fence to check in the morning." He stood, took the letter, and paused at the doorway. "Evelyn." She looked up. "You fought well in Abilene," he said. "Better than most men I've seen in a negotiation." She met his eyes. "Good night, Dylan." He went. She sat alone with her coffee, and the sound of the ranch settling around her, and something warm and inconvenient living in her chest that she absolutely could not afford.
Chapter 2.
The fence survey took 2 days. What they found made her jaw tight and her hands steady in the particular way that happened when she was furious and refusing to show it. Morse's surveyor hadn't just moved the southern markers, he'd driven new stakes along the eastern line as well. Subtle enough that a casual ride wouldn't catch it, significant enough that it shifted nearly 4 acres of her best grazing land outside her legal boundary. 4 acres didn't sound like much until you understood that those 4 acres contained the secondary water source Dylan had found when he deepened the well. Whoever held those acres held leverage over the entire property in a drought year. "He planned this," she said, standing at the 3rd moved stake. "This wasn't opportunistic. He had someone out here before the cattle drive, before the legal papers." "Yes," Dylan said. "While I was in Abilene, he was on my land." "Yes." She pulled the stake out of the ground with her bare hands. "Document everything," she said. "Every stake, every marker, the original fence line. I want measurements." "I brought a surveyor's chain." He held it up. She looked at him. "You anticipated this." "I suspected it," he said. "I hoped I was wrong." They measured. Dylan marked. She wrote figures in a notebook with the same focus she'd brought to Garfield's cattle pen in Abilene, because this was the same fight wearing different clothes, someone with more money than her trying to use procedure to take what wasn't his. By the end of the 2nd day, they had documentation of 11 moved markers across 3 fence lines. Evelyn rolled the notebook up and put it in her coat pocket and stood at the edge of her land looking at the distance. "This is enough for a counterfiling," she said. "If Reed comes." "When Reed comes," Dylan said. She glanced at him. "You're very certain about a man you haven't contacted in years." "Thomas Reed pays his debts," he said. "It's the core of who he is." She thought about that. About men who were defined by what they owed. About the ones who ran from it and the ones who walked back toward it. She tucked the notebook deeper in her pocket and headed back toward the ranch. Samuel came home on a Friday, and the ranch immediately became a different place. Not louder exactly, he was only one small person, but fuller. Like a room that had been missing something specific and suddenly had it back. He arrived from the Pruitts clinging to Evelyn for exactly 4 minutes, which was his personal record for sustained affection before curiosity won. And then he was down and running for the barn before she could finish saying his name. Dylan was at the water trough when Samuel found him. "You came back," Samuel announced. "Said that was the plan," Dylan said. "Plans don't always work." Dylan set down the bucket he was carrying, looked at the boy seriously. "No," he said. "They don't. But this one did." Samuel processed this. "Did you see Abilene?" "I did." "Is it big?" "Very big." "Bigger than Hardin?" "Much bigger." "Did you miss the ranch?" Dylan was quiet for a beat too long. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Samuel nodded, satisfied with the entire report, and immediately began trying to climb the fence rail, which was his standard post-conversation activity. Dylan stood close enough to catch him if he fell, without making it obvious he was doing that, and Evelyn, watching from 10 feet away, felt the familiar ache of it move through her like a slow current. She turned away before it could settle into something she couldn't manage. The reply from Waco came in 11 days. Not a letter. Thomas Reed himself arriving in a buggy that had clearly been driven hard with a leather satchel so full it didn't close properly, and the expression of a man who had read something that made him angry on someone else's behalf. He was 60 maybe, with a white beard trimmed short and eyes that were dark and sharp and moved across everything in the yard like they were cataloging it. He saw Dylan coming from the barn and stopped walking. Something passed across his face. Relief, she thought. And something older than relief. "You look terrible," Reed said. "You look the same," Dylan said. They shook hands, the firm, brief grip of men who had been through something together and didn't need to perform it. "This is Evelyn Hart," Dylan said. Reed turned to her and tipped his hat with a formality that was genuine rather than reflexive. "Mrs. Hart, Thomas Reed. I've read everything Dylan described in his letter, and I've already pulled the county filing records from Hardin on the train." He patted the satchel. "Consolidated Western has done this before. 3 times in the past 4 years, 2 counties over. Same methodology: survey dispute, first legal delay, second pressure campaign, third." "Did they win those cases?" Evelyn asked. Reed's expression did something complicated. "Twice," he said. "Because the property owners didn't have documentation of the original boundaries and couldn't afford to sustain a protracted court case." "I have documentation," she said. She pulled the notebook from her coat. He took it, opened it, scanned the first page. His eyes moved to Dylan. "She measured this herself." "With me," Dylan said. 11 markers across 3 lines, Evelyn said. "Original fence positions, displacement distances, soil disturbance, evidence suggesting recent movement. I cross-referenced against the original property deed survey from 1876. Reed looked at her over the notebook with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. "How did you get the original survey measurements?" "My husband kept every paper this ranch ever generated," she said. "I keep them the same way." He closed the notebook carefully. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I think we have a case." They worked around her kitchen table for the better part of 2 days. Reed spread documents across every surface. Evelyn provided everything she had, and Dylan sat at the corner of the table and contributed with a precision that surprised Reed, visibly knowledge of land law, of how boundary disputes were filed and challenged, of the specific procedural weakness in Consolidated Western's approach. On the second evening, Reed caught Evelyn's eye across the table while Dylan was checking a deed against a survey map and said quietly enough that it was between them. "He told me he was just helping out a widow with a failing ranch." She kept her expression neutral. "That's accurate." Reed looked at Dylan, then back at her. "In my experience," he said, "men who know land law, surveying procedure, and negotiation tactics the way he does don't end up at a struggling ranch without a reason." "He had reasons," she said. "Does he still?" She looked down at the papers in front of her. "That's not something I can answer for him." Reed smiled slightly, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who'd spent 50 years watching people and knew exactly what he was looking at. He went back to his documents. She went back to hers. But the question sat in the kitchen with them for the rest of the evening. On the 3rd morning, Morse came back. He didn't send the nervous young man this time. He came himself, in the same expensive buggy with 2 men behind him on horseback that Evelyn had not seen before, and that Dylan, standing at the barn door when they rode in, assessed in one long, quiet look that changed his posture in a way she'd learned to read. Not defensive. Ready. Reed stepped out onto the porch beside her. Morse's eyes went to him, and something shifted in Morse's smooth, professional manner, a hairline crack fast, and then gone. "Mrs. Hart," Morse said. "I see you have company." "Thomas Reed," Reed said before Evelyn could speak. "Attorney at law, Waco. I represent Mrs. Hart in the matter of your fraudulent boundary filing." He produced a document from his coat pocket. "I'm serving you notice of our counterclaim and our intent to file with the district court in the next 48 hours, along with a complaint to the Texas Land Commission regarding Consolidated Western's surveying practices in this county and the 2 adjacent ones." The 2 mounted men behind Morse looked at each other. Morse's face had stopped performing pleasantness entirely. "That's a significant accusation," Morse said. "It's a documented one," Reed said. "We have original survey records, measurement documentation of your displaced markers, and a pattern of identical conduct in prior counties that establishes intent. I've done this before, Mr. Morse. Have you?" A beat of silence. Morse looked past Reed to Evelyn, then past her, Then to Dillon standing at the barn. "You've been busy," Morse said. "To all of them, and to none of them." "I've been protecting what's mine," Evelyn said. Morse put his pleasant face back on, slightly imperfectly, the way you put on a coat in a hurry. "The bank deadline doesn't move Mrs. Hart." "The bank payment is satisfied," she said. "The second will be by the deadline." That landed. She watched it land. Morse had known about the cattle drive. His rider on the road had confirmed that, but he hadn't known the Abilene price. "Well," he said. And then nothing for a moment. "This isn't over." "No," Reed said pleasantly. "It isn't. We'll see you in district court." Morse turned the buggy. His two riders followed. They went. The yard was quiet. Reed exhaled slowly. "He'll be back," he said. "That man doesn't abandon a play this far into it." "I know," Evelyn said. "The next move won't be legal papers." "I know that too." She looked at Dillon. Across the yard, 20 feet away, he looked back at her. And in his face was the thing she'd seen when he'd stood behind her, when Morse first came. Not protection exactly, but presence. The decision to be there, rather than somewhere else. "How many times has he escalated to something worse than paper?" she asked Reed quietly. Reed was quiet for a moment too long. "Twice," he said. "In the other counties." "What happened?" "One property caught fire," he said. "Cause undetermined. The other the owner was convinced to sell after an incident involving his livestock." The word incident carrying everything he wasn't saying directly. She nodded, went inside, checked the rifle. It happened 11 days later. Not fire, not the livestock. Something faster and more direct, which told her Morse was behind schedule on whatever plan he'd set in motion and was adjusting. She heard it in the night, not a sound that woke her gently, but one that landed her on her feet before she was fully conscious, the particular crash of something large against the side of the barn that wasn't weather and wasn't an animal. She had the rifle before she reached the window. 3 men. She couldn't see faces in the dark, only shapes and the oil lantern one of them carried, which was the thing that sent ice through her blood. An oil lantern near a wooden barn was not a coincidence. She was moving before she'd finished the thought, pulling on her boots going for the door, and Dillon was already there. Already out the barn door, she hadn't seen him come through already, between the 3 men and the wall of the barn, and he had nothing in his hands. "Put it down," he said. Quiet, absolute. The man with the lantern didn't put it down. "Walk away," Dillon said. "Right now. Take your men and walk away." "This doesn't concern you, Drifter," the man with the lantern said. "Yes, it does." Evelyn came off the porch with the rifle at her shoulder. The nearest man turned and saw her and took a step back. She didn't lower the weapon. "My name is on the deed to this land," she said. "Loud enough to carry, clear enough to land. You are on my property without my permission. I will defend it." The man with the lantern looked between her and Dillon, looked at the rifle, looked at Dillon's hands empty and still, which was somehow more unnerving than if he'd been holding something, because there was a quality to his stillness that communicated he had done this kind of calculation before, and the answer it produced was not in these 3 men's favor. "Morse'll hear about this," the lantern man said. "Send him my regards," Evelyn said. They went. Not fast. They kept their dignity, which was the move of men who were told to intimidate, not to fight. But they went, and the lantern went with them, and the barn did not catch fire. When they were gone, she lowered the rifle, and her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her slightly. Dillon turned to look at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." She checked the rifle out of habit. Your hands were empty." "I know. Against 3 men. I didn't want to fire unless I had to." He looked at the direction the men had gone. "They were sent to frighten, not to shoot. There's a difference in how they move." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been sent to do both," he said. "And I know the difference." The admission sat between them in the dark. She had known in an abstract way what he'd told her about his past. But this was different. This was him applying that knowledge in real time, reading violent men the way she read cattle or weather. "They'll come back," she said, "with more or with different orders." "Yes." "What do we do?" He looked at her. "We don't wait for them to choose the moment," he said. "We go to the sheriff tomorrow morning. We file a formal report. We give Reed the incident to add to the district court filing." His jaw set. "And we get neighbors." "Neighbors," she repeated. "Morse is counting on you being alone out here. He's always counted on that. What happens if you're not?" She thought about Harriet Pruitt, who had taken Samuel in without a second thought while complaining about it. The Pruitt boys who had ridden a cattle drive because she asked. Old Pete, who had met her at the gate with 3 things she needed to know, delivered in order of importance. "People here have been talking about me," she said. "Half this county thinks I'm a scandal. Half this county also doesn't want a land company from the east buying up properties one by one," Dylan said. "Because once they take yours, Evelyn, whose fence line moves next." She held his gaze in the dark. That was the argument. Not charity, not pity. Self-interest and shared stake, the only foundation that held in hard country. "I'll talk to people," she said. "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He said it with a patience that was almost exasperation. "I've established that I don't have to do any of this. I'm aware." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're very stubborn, Mr. McCall." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "So are you." Something that wasn't quite a laugh came out of her, surprised and involuntary and real in a way that she couldn't take back. He almost smiled. The almost smile she'd been cataloging for weeks, the one that lived right at the edge of his face and never quite made it all the way. She turned back to the house. Samuel would be awake and frightened from the noise, and she needed to get back to him. "Dylan," she said at the door. He stopped. "What they said that this doesn't concern you." She kept her back to him because she wasn't sure what her face was doing. "Is that true? Are you here because you have nowhere else to be? Or is there another reason?" Silence behind her, long enough that she almost regretted asking. "There's another reason," he said. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe, stood there for 1 breath, 2. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Evelyn." She went inside. Samuel was at the top of the stairs with wide eyes, and his wooden horse clutched to his chest. "Were those bad men?" he asked. "Yes," she said, because she didn't lie to him about things like that. "Did Dylan make them go?" She thought about the 3 men and the lantern and Dylan's empty hands and the quality of his stillness. "We made them go," she said. "Together." Samuel considered this with his grave 4-year-old seriousness. "Good," he said. Then he held out the wooden horse. "Dylan can have this tonight, so he doesn't get scared." She took the small horse, held it in her palm. "I'll give it to him," she said. She didn't sleep much. She sat at the kitchen table with the rifle beside her, and the wooden horse in front of her, and her notebook of fence measurements and Reed's legal papers spread around her, and she looked at all of it. The evidence of a fight that was escalating the tools of a defense. She was building piece by piece the small carved horse her son had offered to a man he'd decided to trust. And she made a different kind of calculation than the ones she usually made. Not about money. Not about deadlines. About what it meant that when those 3 men had come out of the dark, her first thought had not been of the barn, or the cattle, or the legal papers. Her first thought had been, "Where is Dylan?" She turned the wooden horse over in her hands. The paint was worn off one side where Samuel had carried it in his fist for 2 years. She set it on the windowsill where the first light would hit it in the morning. Then she went back to her numbers because the ranch was not going to save itself, and neither was she. She gave him the wooden horse in the morning, didn't make a thing of it, set it on the fence post nearest the barn when she went out at first light where he'd find it when he came to check the horses. No note, no explanation. He would understand or he wouldn't, and either way she had a sheriff to visit and neighbors to talk to and a legal case to build. and sentiment was something she could afford exactly this much of and no more. She was at the pump filling the water bucket when she heard him stop walking. She didn't turn around, kept pumping. A long pause behind her. Then he said, "Samuel give you this to pass along. He said you could have it so you wouldn't get scared." Another pause. "That boy." "Yes," she said. "That boy." She picked up the bucket and walked past him toward the house, and felt his eyes on her back the whole way, and she kept her face forward and her pace even, and told herself that the warmth in her chest was just the morning air turning, and nothing more complicated than that. It was considerably more complicated than that. The sheriff's office opened at 8. She was there at 8:02 with Dylan beside her and Reed's documentation under her arm, and she laid it all out for Sheriff Cal Briggs with the same organized precision she'd used in Abilene, incident, date, time, number of men description, the oil lantern, the direction they came from the direction they left. Briggs was a big, slow-moving man with a face that gave nothing away easily. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, which she respected. When she finished, he sat back in his chair. "You're saying these men were sent by Elijah Morse," he said. "I'm saying 3 men came onto my property at night with a lantern, were confronted, and retreated when it became clear we weren't going to be intimidated. I am saying that Morse has already filed a fraudulent boundary dispute against my property and sent legal threats to my home. The reasonable inference is yours to make." Briggs looked at Dylan. "You were present for this?" "Yes," Dylan said. "You're working the Hart Ranch?" "Yes." "Where are you from originally, Mr. McCall?" Dylan said. "And the question you're working toward isn't relevant to what Mrs. Hart just told you." Briggs's eyes went slightly flat. "I'll determine what's relevant. 3 men with a lantern at a wooden barn at night," Dylan said evenly. "That's what's relevant. Mrs. Hart filed this report so that when something worse happens, there's a documented prior incident. You understand what that means for how this county looks if something worse happens and there's no record you were told." A silence. Briggs looked at Dylan the way men looked at other men when they were deciding whether to push back or concede the point. He conceded it. "I'll send a deputy out to look at the fence line," he said. "Today," Evelyn said. Briggs looked at her. "Today," he said. She stood. "Thank you, Sheriff." Outside, Reed fell into step beside her, having waited on the bench in the hall with the patience of a man who'd spent a lot of years waiting in courthouse halls. "Well done," he said. "He'll do the minimum," she said. "The minimum is documented," Reed said. "Right now that's what we need." Dylan said nothing. He was watching the street the way he'd watched the 3 men the night before. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the focused awareness of a man who understood that danger didn't always announce itself. She had noticed in the 11 days since the cattle drive that he'd changed his patterns. He was up earlier than she was now consistently. He checked the perimeter of the property before he started any other work. He had, without saying anything about it, moved from treating the ranch as a job to treating it as something he was defending. She hadn't asked him to do that. She hadn't had to. Talking to neighbors was harder than the sheriff, not because people refused, they didn't, but because each conversation required a version of her pride that she was still learning to put down. She had spent a year being the woman who didn't ask for help, who managed alone, who met every difficulty with her chin level and her needs private. Walking up to people's doors and saying, "I need you to stand with me," was a different kind of strength than the kind she'd been practicing, and it was harder in ways she hadn't anticipated. Harriet Pruitt was first. Harriet opened the door, looked at Evelyn, looked at Dylan, standing a respectful distance behind her, and said, "I heard what happened last night. Pete told Clem told me. Come in." She fed them both before Evelyn had said a single word about why she'd come. Coffee and biscuits, and the particular forceful hospitality of a woman who expressed care through feeding people. Dylan ate with the same unhurried manners he always had, and answered Harriet's questions about the cattle drive in the direct, factual way that Evelyn had noticed tended to disarm people who'd been prepared to be suspicious of him. "The fence markers," Harriet said when Evelyn had explained the whole thing. "If they moved yours, they'll move ours next." Yes, Evelyn said. Harriet set down her coffee cup. What do you need? Witnesses. People who'll testify in district court about the original boundary lines as they've always existed. People who know this land. I've lived here 20 years, Harriet said. I know every fence line in this county by heart. She paused. Who else are you talking to? The Millers, the Dawes family. Anyone who shares a boundary with Land Consolidated Western has been looking at. Harriet nodded slowly. George Miller's been nervous all spring. He won't say so, but his wife told me he got a visit from a land company man last fall, before Morse came to you. Evelyn looked at Dylan. He was looking at Harriet with focused attention. They approached Miller before me, Evelyn said. From what Clara Miller said, yes. He turned them down and they went quiet. Then they came back to you. They're building from the outside in, Dylan said, taking the properties that border the target first or weakening them so that when the center property yours becomes isolated, there's no one left to stand with you. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. That's exactly what they're doing, Reed said from the corner where he'd been listening. He'd been invited along on the basis that a lawyer's presence at these conversations might carry weight. I've seen this before. They acquire or neutralize the surrounding parcels first. George Miller needs to know this, Harriet said. That's where we're going next, Evelyn said. Harriet stood up. I'm coming with you. Evelyn looked at her. At this woman who had taken her son in without hesitation and criticized her life choices without cruelty, and now stood up from her kitchen table like the decision had been made before Evelyn even knocked on the door. Harriet, she said. Don't thank me, Harriet said, already getting her coat. It makes me uncomfortable, and we don't have time for it. Though, by the end of that day, they had 6 families. 6 families who knew the land, who knew the fence lines, who had their own reasons to worry about what Consolidated Western was building in Hardin County. Some came easily, the Millers, once Evelyn explained the pattern were ready before she finished talking. The Dawes family took longer, careful people who didn't commit until they understood exactly what they were committing to, and she respected that and answered every question they had. One family, the Hendersons, said no. She thanked them and moved on, because you didn't shame people into standing with you. You gave them the choice, and you kept walking. Driving back to the ranch that evening, Dylan and Reed in the buggy behind her, Harriet having gone home to her own family, Evelyn let herself feel the weight of what had shifted. She had spent a year being alone in the way that felt like the only available option. 1 year of managing everything herself, refusing help, keeping her head down and her needs invisible because needing things made you vulnerable and she could not afford vulnerable. 6 families. 6 sets of people who would stand in district court and say, we know this land, and we know what it was, and we know what was moved and who moved it. She was not alone. She had not been alone for a while, she realized. She had simply been too proud and too frightened to look up and see it. Reed left the following morning back to Waco to file the counterclaim and begin the formal proceedings. He shook her hand at the buggy with both of his, which she understood was a form of endorsement from a man who was careful with his expressions. This is going to get worse before it gets better, he said. You understand that? I do. Morse will make a move before the court date. He always does. He can't afford to let this go to a judge with the documentation you have. What kind of move? Reed looked at Dylan. The kind that tests how much a person wants to hold on, he said. Dylan met his eyes. Something passed between them, the knowledge of men who had seen the specific category of thing Reed was describing, who knew what it looked like up close. She'll hold, Dylan said. Quiet and certain, not a performance. Reed looked at her one more time. I believe it, he said. He drove out. She stood in the yard and watched him go. He likes you, Dylan said. He likes my documentation, she said. Same thing in his world. She almost laughed. Almost. What did he mean? She said. The look he gave you, what kind of move is he expecting? Dylan was quiet for a beat. Something personal, he said. Something that hits where the papers can't protect you. She turned to look at him directly. Me? or Samuel? The answer was in the way his face tightened before he controlled it. Samuel isn't leaving the property without one of us, she said, immediately, completely. Agreed. And old Pete doesn't go anywhere alone until this is over. I already talked to Pete. She stared at him. When? This morning before you were up. She searched his face. He had done this thought of Pete had the conversation handled it before she'd woken up, before she'd known to think of it. Dylan, she said, and then stopped because what she wanted to say was complicated and the yard was not the place for it. I know, he said, quietly, like he knew exactly what she'd stopped herself from saying. She turned back to the house. Come in for coffee, she said. We need to talk about the next 2 weeks before the court date. All right. They went inside together. Samuel was at the table eating his breakfast, his wooden horse back in his fist. Apparently Dylan had returned it, or maybe Samuel had simply retrieved it without asking which was more likely. He looked up when they came in. You're both here, he observed with the satisfaction of a child who approved of the arrangement and felt no need to be subtle about it. Both here, Evelyn confirmed. She went to the stove. Dylan sat across from Samuel. Finish your breakfast, he said. I am finishing it, Samuel said. I'm also talking. You can do both. Can you? I do it all the time. Samuel held up the wooden horse. Did you know horses can sleep standing up? You told me that. I did. I told Harriet's boy about it, and he didn't believe me. Some things are hard to believe until you see them. Samuel considered this. Like you, he said. The kitchen went quiet, except for the sound of the stove. Dylan looked at the boy for a moment. What do you mean? He said carefully. Mama didn't believe you were going to stay, Samuel said with perfect 4-year-old clarity. I could tell, but you did. Evelyn kept her back to the table and focused on the coffee with extraordinary concentration. Yeah, Dylan said. I did. Are you going to keep staying? A pause, longer than the ones Dylan usually allowed himself. That's something I'd have to talk to your mother about, he said. You could talk to her now, Samuel said helpfully. She's right there. I can see that. Mama. Samuel's voice directed at her back. Dylan wants to talk to you. She turned around. Dylan was looking at the table with an expression that was caught somewhere between exasperated and something much more honest. Samuel was eating his breakfast with the satisfaction of a child who had successfully managed a social situation. She put the coffee on the table, sat down, and looked at Dylan across the width of a kitchen that had become, without her fully noticing the moment it happened, something different from what it had been 6 weeks ago. What did you want to say? She asked. He looked up at her. Not here, he said. Not in front of Dylan, Samuel said without looking up from his horse. Yeah, I already know you like my mama. He said it with tremendous matter-of-factness. It's okay. I like you too. The kitchen was silent. Then something happened that she had not seen in the entire 6 weeks she had known Dylan McCall. He laughed. Not a polite sound, not a controlled release. An actual laugh surprised out of him, real and unguarded, and it changed his whole face into something she hadn't seen yet, and that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Samuel looked very pleased with himself. Evelyn pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling and told herself firmly that she was not going to cry because she had a court date in 2 weeks and a land agent trying to take her property, and she absolutely could not afford to sit in her kitchen and cry because a man she had known for 6 weeks laughed at something her 4-year-old said. She was going to do it anyway. She could feel it coming. Evelyn, Dylan said. She looked at him. His face was still open from the laugh, still warm with it, and he was looking at her with something she had no armor left for. I'm not leaving, he said. Not unless you tell me to. And even then I'd argue. She pressed her lips together, held it. That's very presumptuous of you. Yes, ma'am, he said. It is. Samuel set down his horse with a decisive clank against the table. Good, he said. Now can we have more biscuits? The attack came 8 days before the court date. Not at night this time. Afternoon, which was worse in a specific way. Afternoon said they were past the phase of trying to frighten her. Past sending 3 men with a lantern to test her nerve. Dylan heard it first. Horses on the road, more than 2 coming fast and then slowing as they hit the property boundary. He was at the fence with Clem Pruitt. Clem had been coming every day since the night visit, quietly without being asked the Pruitt family's version of standing with someone, and he said one word. Inside. Clem moved. Dylan turned toward the house. Evelyn was already on the porch. She had heard the horses too. 4 men. Different from the first 3, these were not men sent to intimidate. She understood that in the first 5 seconds, the same way Dylan had understood it about the others in reverse. There was a quality to deliberate violence that was distinct from performed threat, and this had that quality. The one in front she recognized from town. A man named Carr, who did rough work for whoever was paying. She had seen him in the saloon. She had never spoken to him. "Mrs. Hart," Carr said, "Mr. Morse has reconsidered his offer." "Mr. Morse can reconsider it by himself," she said. "He thought you might say that." Carr's eyes moved past her to Dylan coming around the side of the house. "He also figured you'd have your man with you." He paused. "He sent enough to account for that." Dylan came to stand beside her on the porch. She felt him assess the 4 men, the same way he'd assessed the 3 before, but this time the assessment took longer, and whatever it produced was more serious. "You 4 turn around and ride back," Dylan said. "This doesn't have to go further than this." "It already went further," Carr said. "The day she decided to fight a court case instead of taking a fair offer." "I'll fight him in court and win," Evelyn said. "You tell him that." "I don't think he's interested in court anymore," Carr said, and moved his horse forward. What happened next was fast and complicated, and she was present for every second of it in the hyper-clear way that danger produces everything slow and sharp at the same time, every detail bright. Dylan came off the porch. Not backing up, not angling away directly toward the horses, which was not what Carr had calculated, and the calculation gap bought 3 seconds. Clem Pruitt came from the left with a rifle she hadn't seen him pick up. Old Pete appeared from the barn door with a shotgun which she absolutely had not known he owned, and from the road hoofbeats, not the attack kind, the arriving kind. 2 riders. She squinted. Holt Pruitt and George Miller coming at a canter, and behind them, she couldn't believe it, Harriet, in her buggy with the Dawes boy on the seat beside her. Carr looked at the 4 men beside him. Looked at Dylan, who had stopped walking and was standing 10 feet from his horse with empty hands and the particular stillness that had already proved it communicated something specific to men who understood violence. Looked at Clem's rifle, Pete's shotgun, the arriving riders. Did the arithmetic. "This isn't over," he said. "You keep saying that," Dylan said, "but you keep leaving." Carr turned his horse. His men followed. They rode out the way they'd come, fast and without looking back, and the yard exhaled. Holt Pruitt pulled up and looked at the retreating riders. "We saw them on the road," he said. "Figured they weren't heading to your place for a social call." Evelyn looked at the assembled people in her yard. Clem with his rifle. Pete with his shotgun. She was going to have a conversation with Pete about that shotgun. Holt and George and Harriet and the Dawes boy, who was 17, and had come because Harriet told him to, and apparently that was sufficient reason. And Dylan 10 feet from where Carr's horse had been turning back toward the porch, and she saw his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, she understood, but from the controlled release of something he'd been holding very tightly for the past 3 minutes. She crossed the yard to him, stopped in front of him. He looked at her, she looked back. "You walk toward them," she said, empty-handed. "It was the fastest way to change their math," he said. "That was insane." "It worked. Dylan." Her voice was quieter than she intended. "Don't ever do that again." He looked at her face for a moment. Really looked at it the way he sometimes did when he was taking in information he wanted to keep. "All right," he said, quietly. She was standing close enough to him that she could see the last of the tension leaving his jaw. She thought about what he'd said in the kitchen 8 days ago. "I'm not leaving, not unless you tell me to," and she thought about what she was going to say when there was a moment that wasn't surrounded by rifles and neighbors, and the aftermath of 4 men who'd come to take away everything she'd built. She put her hand on his arm. Just her hand on his arm briefly in the way of people who don't have the words yet but have the feeling and need to put it somewhere. He went still under her hand, and then his hand came up and covered hers just for a moment, just long enough to mean something. George Miller was talking to Holt behind them. Harriet was already organizing the way Harriet organized crises by feeding people and assigning tasks. Pete was putting away the shotgun. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "In a minute," he said. He was looking at the road where Carr had gone, the way a man looks at a thing that's retreated but not disappeared. "Dylan." He turned. "Come inside," she said again, softer. He came. That evening, after everyone had gone home and Samuel was asleep and the ranch was quiet in the particular way that followed a day that had asked too much of everyone, she found herself in the kitchen again. The place she seemed to end up when something had to be said. He came in from the last perimeter check and stopped when he saw her at the table. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say for 3 hours, and she still didn't have language that felt adequate for it. So she said the plain version because that was usually the right version. "When Carr's men were in the yard today," she said, "I wasn't frightened for the ranch." She paused. "I was frightened for you." He was very still. "That's new," she said. "That wasn't true 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, you were a stranger who knew how to fix a fence." She looked at the table. "I need you to know that it's changed. What this is, for me." She made herself look up at him. "I need you to know because I'm not a woman who says things she doesn't mean, and I'm not a woman who lets things go unsaid because they're inconvenient. I've done too much of that." The lamp between them. The same lamp as always. He said, "Evelyn, let me finish." He nodded. "I don't know what you are to me yet," she said. "I don't know what to call it. I know that Samuel was right about the obvious thing, and I know that She stopped, gathered herself. "I know that when I open that door in the morning and you're already up and working, I feel something I haven't felt in over a year. And I know that's not nothing, and I know I'm terrified of it, and I know I'm going to feel it anyway." The kitchen was completely quiet. Dylan looked at her across the lamp with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled, careful quality, not the assessment, not the almost smile. Something open and undefended that she understood cost him considerably. "You're my first?" she whispered. She felt heat rush into her face, the particular helpless heat of vulnerability said out loud. "The first person I've—" She stopped again. Her voice had gone small on her, and she hated it. "Since Robert. The first person I've wanted to—" She stopped. He was already standing up. He moved around the table slowly, the way he did everything, unhurried, deliberate, giving her every chance to say stop. And she didn't say stop. And he stopped in front of her, and when she finally looked up at him, he was looking at her with everything he'd been carrying quietly for 6 weeks, all of it present, and none of it hidden. "And you'll be my last," he said, low and certain and not performed at all. "That's a promise, Evelyn, not a pretty thing to say. A promise." She pressed her lips together. The ceiling again, she was looking at the ceiling because she had promised herself she wasn't going to cry, and she was going to honor at least one promise tonight, even if he was making it considerably difficult. His hand came up, and his thumb caught the thing she hadn't managed to stop at the corner of her eye, and she looked at him instead of the ceiling because there was nowhere else left to look. "Okay," she said. Her voice was barely there. "Okay," he said. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. That wasn't what this moment was, and he understood what the moment was, which was one more thing about him she would carry forward. He sat down beside her, close enough that their arms touched, and he stayed there, and she stayed there, and outside the ranch held its ground in the dark. Samuel's wooden horse sat on the windowsill where she'd put it, waiting for the light. She didn't sleep that night, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the ones before it. Not the grinding, calculating wakefulness of a woman adding up numbers that didn't balance. Not the alert, rifle-close vigilance of someone waiting for hoofbeats in the dark. This was quieter than both of those. She sat at the kitchen table after Dylan had gone back to the barn, and she held her own hands in her lap and let herself feel the full weight of what had been said, not to manage it, or file it away, or turn it into a task with steps, but just to feel it, because she had been so efficient at not feeling things for so long that the act of allowing it seemed to require practice. He had said, "And you'll be my last." She had said okay. And the entire architecture of the life she'd been surviving had shifted on its foundation, not collapsing, but resettling into something that could hold more weight than survival alone. She was still at the table when the first light came through the window and hit Samuel's wooden horse on the sill and turned it gold. Court date was in 7 days. Reed sent word from Waco that the counterclaim had been filed and accepted that the district judge assigned to the case had a reputation for impartiality that Morse's money had not yet compromised, and that 3 of the prior consolidated Western cases in adjacent counties were being reviewed for connection to this filing. The last piece of information Reed had underlined twice in his letter, which she understood was the equivalent of another man shouting. "They're going to try to settle before the court date," Dylan said, reading the letter at the kitchen table while Samuel ate his breakfast and offered commentary on everything. "Morse doesn't want this in front of a judge," Evelyn agreed. "Not with documentation from 6 families and a pattern of conduct across 3 counties. "He'll come with a new offer," Dylan said. "Better than the first one, designed to look generous enough to make the court fight seem like stubbornness." "It is stubbornness," Samuel said helpfully. They both looked at him. "Harriet told her boy that Mama is the most stubborn woman in Hardin County," Samuel explained without any apparent sense that this information was private. Dylan looked at Evelyn. "She's not wrong," he said. "I prefer determined," Evelyn said. "Of course you do." She fought the smile and lost it partially, and looked back at Reed's letter to cover the loss. Dylan looked back at the letter too, but she saw the corner of his mouth from the angle she was sitting at, and she filed it away with all the other things she was filing about him. The ones she'd been accumulating since the night he'd come up her drive and asked for water and a meal. Morse's new offer arrived on day 3. Not Morse himself, he was past delivering things personally, which told her the court filing had landed where Reed had intended it to land. The offer came with a young lawyer she hadn't seen before, sharp-suited and nervous, who handed her a sealed envelope and waited on the porch while she read it. She read it twice, folded it, looked at the lawyer. "Tell Mr. Morse the answer is no," she said. The lawyer blinked. "Mrs. Hart, I'd encourage you to consider the offer represents a significant—" "I know what it represents," she said. "It represents a man who is afraid of what a judge is going to see in 7 days. Tell him no." The lawyer left. She unfolded the offer again and looked at the number on it, considerably higher than the first one, high enough that 6 months ago it would have felt like rescue, and she felt nothing except a clean, clear certainty that this land was not for sale at any number Elijah Morse could produce. Dylan came around from the side of the house. He'd been close enough to hear she knew without being visible. "How much?" he asked. She told him. He let out a slow breath. "That's a serious number." "It is," she said. "It's also an admission." He looked at her. "Of what?" "That he knows he's losing." She folded the paper one more time. "A man who thinks he's going to win in court doesn't triple his offer 4 days before the hearing." Dylan studied her face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She tucked the paper in her pocket. "Are you—" He understood what she was asking. Not about the court case. About all of it. The ranch, the fight, the 7 days of whatever came next, the longer thing that lived past all of it, that neither of them had put a full name to yet, but that sat in every room of the house now, like it belonged there. "I've been sure for a while," he said. She nodded once, went back inside. On day 5, Morse made his last move, and it wasn't paper. She got word from Harriet, who got it from Clara Miller, who heard it from her husband, who had it from a rider passing through from the county seat. Consolidated Western had filed an emergency motion to disqualify Reed on the basis of a conflict of interest. The claim was manufactured. Reed wrote back within hours, and he'd already drafted the response, but the motion would require a hearing, and the hearing would push the court date by at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which the bank's secondary deadline would arrive. She read Reed's letter standing in the yard, and felt the particular rage that came from watching someone with resources use procedure as a weapon, not because he was right, but because he could afford to be slow and she couldn't. "He's buying time," she said. "Yes," Dylan said. "The bank payment." "I know." She looked at him. "We don't have another cattle drive in us before that deadline." "No," he said. "We don't." He was quiet for a moment. "But we might have something else." She waited. "The adjacent parcel," he said. "The one Morse has been trying to use the boundary dispute to claim. If the boundary dispute is dismissed, which it will be with the documentation we have, that parcel is yours by the original deed. Undisputed." "It's mine now by the original deed," she said. "He just manufactured a claim against it." "Right, but there's a water source on that parcel." He met her eyes. "George Miller's been running cattle on dry range for 2 seasons. If you lease him grazing rights to that parcel with water access, you generate income that doesn't require a drive or a sale." She stared at him. The idea arranged itself in her mind with the speed of something that fit precisely into the space available for it. "A lease agreement," she said. "Legal, documented, filed with the county. Income against the bank deadline, and it establishes active use of the disputed parcel, which strengthens your position at the hearing, regardless of when it happens." "You've been thinking about this," she said, "for a few days. You didn't say anything." "I wanted to make sure it held up before I said it." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who thought carefully before he spoke, who checked his work before he offered it, who had walked toward 4 armed men with empty hands and called it math. "How do I not know about this kind of thing?" she said. Not self-criticism genuine. "Land law's not obvious," he said. "I had reasons to learn it that weren't good ones. This is the first time it's been useful for something that is." She pulled out the notebook she carried everywhere and opened to a blank page. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." He told her. She wrote. And by the time they went inside for the evening, they had a lease structure that Reed confirmed by return wire the following morning was sound legal and exactly the kind of active use documentation that would make a judge's decision considerably easier. George Miller signed it the same day. The hearing on Reed's disqualification was set for the following Tuesday, which was 3 days before the rescheduled court date. Evelyn drove to the county seat herself, Dylan beside her Harriet, and the Pruitt boys, and George Miller in wagons behind them, because she had decided that if Morse wanted to use procedure as a spectacle, she was going to make the spectacle work in her favor. The hearing room was not large. It became considerably less large when the Hart party arrived and filled the back 3 rows. Morse was already there. He looked at the people filing in behind Evelyn with the controlled expression of a man recalculating. And she met his eyes across the room and held them and looked away first for exactly no reason. Reed stood at the front with his leather satchel and the unruffled manner of a man who had been in considerably worse rooms than this one. The Consolidated Western lawyer, the young sharp-suited one, sat at the opposite table with a stack of documents and the expression of someone who had been told this motion was a formality and was now looking at a room full of Hardin County farmers and revising that assessment. The judge was a woman. Evelyn had not expected that. She did not let the surprise show, but she felt Dylan go slightly still beside her in the way he went still when something shifted the calculation. Judge Abigail Marsh was 60 gray-haired and had the eyes of a person who had heard every variety of human excuse and found most of them inadequate. She read the disqualification motion in complete silence while the room held its breath. Then she set it down. "Counsel," she said to the Consolidated Western lawyer, I've read your motion. I've also read Mr. Reed's response. And I've read the original filing in this case. She paused. The conflict of interest you're alleging is that Mr. Reed previously represented a client whose case touched on similar issues of land boundary dispute in an adjacent county. Is that the substance of it? Your Honor, the prior case establishes a pattern of, I know what it establishes, Judge Marsh said. What it does not establish is a conflict that disqualifies counsel in this proceeding. She picked up the motion, set it back down. Motion denied. The consolidated Western lawyer opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Judge Marsh said pleasantly. I'm also moving the original court date back to this Thursday. I don't see a reason to wait further. The room exhaled. Morse in the second row on the opposite side went very still. Reed turned and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was as close to satisfied as she'd seen from him, which on his face was substantial. Dillon leaned slightly toward her. Thursday, he said quietly. Thursday, she said. Thursday came in the way that days you have been building toward for months finally arrive, faster than everything before them, and slower than you want them to be both at once. She wore the blue dress she'd worn to Robert's funeral, which was the best thing she owned, and she looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 10 seconds before she decided that was enough and went to the kitchen to put coffee on. Dillon was already up. He was always already up. He looked at her when she came in, looked at the dress, looked at her face. You look, he started. Don't, she said. I was going to say ready, he said. She looked at him. He was in the cleanest shirt she'd seen him wear, his jaw shaved to a smoothness that he only managed on Sundays, his hat in his hands rather than on his head. You cleaned up, she said. Seemed like the occasion warranted it. Samuel appeared from his room in his good shirt, which was already untucked on one side, his wooden horse in his fist. Are we winning today? He asked. Yes, Dillon said. Samuel nodded, tucked the horse in his pocket, retucked his shirt unsuccessfully, and sat down for breakfast with the confidence of a 4-year-old who had been told the important thing and needed no further information. Tate. The courtroom was the largest room in Hardin County's civic life, and it was by 9 in the morning nearly full. Not because land disputes drew crowds they didn't usually. But 6 families had told 6 more families, and word had moved through the county, in the way that word moves through a place where everyone knows what happens to one property is a question about all of them. The Pruitt family took up an entire row. The Millers were there, and the Dawes family, and faces she recognized from the general store, and the church, and the road into town, and faces she didn't recognize at all. People from properties she didn't know who had heard what Consolidated Western was building and had decided to come and watch. Morse sat at his table with 2 lawyers now, which told her that Reed's counter-filing with the Land Commission had cost Consolidated Western something they hadn't expected to spend. Judge Marsh came in, and the room went quiet. What happened in the next 4 hours was not dramatic in the way of violence or confrontation. It was dramatic in the way of truth laid out in sequence piece by piece until the picture it made was undeniable. Reed presented the original survey, the documented displacements, the measurement records she and Dillon had made at every moved marker. He presented the pattern from the adjacent counties, 3 cases, same methodology, same company. He presented the lease agreement with George Miller as evidence of active property use. The Consolidated Western lawyers objected to 17 things. Judge Marsh sustained 4 of them and overruled the rest with a brevity that suggested she had limited patience for delay as a legal strategy. Then Reed called witnesses. Harriet Pruitt took the stand and described the boundary lines of Hardin County properties as she had known them for 20 years, with the specific, unassailable confidence of a woman who had never been uncertain about where her land ended and someone else's began. George Miller testified that the displaced markers contradicted boundary lines he had observed and respected for 15 years as Evelyn's neighbor. And then Reed called Dillon. She had not known he was going to do this. Dillon had not told her. She looked at Reed, and he gave her a slight nod that said, "Trust me." And she looked at Dylan, who was already standing, already moving to the stand, with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything. He stated his name, his occupation, how long he had been employed at the Hart Ranch. Then Reed said, "Mr. McCall, before your current employment, what was your professional background?" Morse's lead lawyer looked up. Dylan said, "I served in the Union Army as a survey specialist. After the war, I was contracted for land assessment work in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. I spent 4 years doing boundary verification and deed documentation for disputed property claims." The courtroom was very quiet. "In your professional assessment," Reed said, "what do the measurements documented in this record indicate about the markers found on the Hart property?" "They indicate deliberate displacement," Dylan said. "The consistency of the offset distances ranging between 8 and 11 feet across all 11 markers is not consistent with natural movement, livestock pressure, or fence repair. It is consistent with intentional relocation by someone with surveying knowledge. Could this displacement have occurred accidentally? No," Dylan said. "Not 11 markers across 3 fence lines with that degree of consistency." The consolidated Western lawyer was on his feet. The objection was overruled before he finished making it. She sat in the gallery and looked at the man on the witness stand. This man who had come up her drive with dust on every surface of him and asked for water and a meal, and she understood that she had never known not fully what she had let in the gate that evening. Not the dangerous parts she'd worried about, the other parts. The depth of him, the full extent of what he carried, and what he knew, and what he had decided to spend it on. He had not told her about the survey work. He had just done it. Shown up and done it the same way he'd fixed the fence and deepened the well and stood between her and 4 men with empty hands. Her throat was tight. She kept her face composed because she was Evelyn Hart, and this was her courtroom, and she had a reputation in this county to maintain. But her hands folded in her lap were holding each other harder than usual. Judge Marsh's ruling came 40 minutes after closing arguments. The boundary dispute filed by Consolidated Western Land was dismissed with prejudice. The displaced markers were ordered restored at the company's expense. The counterclaim documenting the original Hart property boundaries was entered into the county record as the legal standard. And Judge Marsh, in language that Reed told her afterward, was unusually direct for a written ruling, noted that the pattern of conduct documented across 3 counties warranted referral to the Texas Land Commission for investigation of Consolidated Western's surveying practices statewide. That last piece, that was the one that meant this didn't just end for her. That meant the thing Morse had been building county by county, property by property, that ended. She sat in the courtroom after people began filing out, and she held very still for a moment, because sometimes the thing you've been fighting for arrives, and the body doesn't know immediately how to carry something other than the fight. Dylan sat down beside her. Not touching, just there. "It's done," he said. "Not the bank payment," she said, because her mind went immediately to the next thing, the way it always did. "The Miller lease covers it," he said. "We calculated it." "Right." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "Right. Evelyn." She looked at him. "It's done," he said again, softer. She let the breath out. All of it. The one she'd been holding in various configurations for 14 months since Robert died, since the bank started sending letters, since the land began cracking under a sun that didn't know when to stop. She let it out, all of it at once, and what replaced it was something she didn't have a word for, except that it felt like ground. Solid ground under her feet for the first time in over a year. She put her hand over his on the bench between them. He turned his hand over and held hers. Samuel, sitting on her other side, looked at their joined hands, and then up at Dylan, and then at his mother, and said nothing, which was the most restrained he had been in 4 weeks, and which cost him visibly, and she loved him so much, in that moment, she couldn't speak. The proposal happened in the kitchen. Of course it did. 3 weeks after the court ruling, 2 weeks after the bank confirmed the mortgage was current, 10 days after Reed sent word that the Land Commission investigation had formally opened, and Consolidated Western had suspended all acquisition activity in the state pending review. 3 weeks of the ranch being for the first time in over a year simply a ranch, not a battlefield, not a crisis, just a piece of Texas ground with cattle on it, and work to be done, and people who did it together. She was doing accounts. Because she was always doing accounts. He came in from the last check of the evening and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter for a moment and then turned around and said without preamble, without any of the careful measured pauses she'd come to know, "Marry me." She looked up from the accounts. He was looking at her with everything present, no managed quality, no controlled surface. Just Dylan McCall at 32 years old, with everything he'd survived and everything he'd done, and everything he'd spent the last 3 months choosing standing in her kitchen, asking her something that cost him every piece of the armor he'd been building since the war. "That's not a question," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him for a long moment. At the hands that had fixed her fence and deepened her well and stood empty between her and violence, and written a letter to a lawyer in Waco, and measured 11 moved fence markers in the July heat. At the face she had watched for 3 months, become without her planning it, the one she looked for first in every room. "Samuel's going to be insufferable about this," she said. "I know. He's going to tell everyone in town. He's already told Harriet Pruitt he thinks I should stay permanently," Dylan said. 3 weeks ago. She stared at him. "He did not." "Harriet told me herself. Said she agreed with his assessment." She looked at the ceiling which had received more of her emotional overflow in the past 3 months than any ceiling deserved. "That child," she said. "Evelyn." She looked back at him. "Yes," she said, plain and clear, and without qualification, the same way she'd said everything that mattered in her life. "Yes." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He took her face in both hands, the way she'd seen him do with nothing carefully, like she was something he intended to keep. And he kissed her, and it was the first kiss of whatever was coming next, and it tasted like the end of something, and the beginning of everything else. Samuel appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, because Samuel had the timing of a child who had been waiting for this exact moment and had stationed himself accordingly. "Are you getting married?" he asked. Dylan pulled back far enough to look at him. "Yes." Samuel pumped his fist in a gesture he had definitely learned from Clem Pruitt and did not fully understand the cultural context of. "I told Harriet," he announced, and disappeared back to his room. Evelyn pressed her forehead against Dylan's chest and laughed, the real kind, unguarded and full, the kind she'd almost forgotten she could make. His arms came around her, and he held her the way a man holds something he was afraid he'd never have. They married on a Saturday in October, when the Texas heat had finally broken, and the sky was the particular blue that only came in autumn, and the land which had cracked and suffered through a merciless summer had begun quietly to heal. The minister came out from town. The Pruitt family came in their Sunday best, Harriet crying before the ceremony started and denying it to anyone who commented. The Millers came, and the Dawes family and old Pete, who had put on a hat she had never seen before, and who stood very straight in the way of a man marking an occasion he considered important. Reed had ridden up from Waco because Dylan had written to him, and he stood at the edge of the gathering with his hands folded and an expression of quiet satisfaction that was the most emotional she had ever seen him allow. Samuel stood between them at the front because he had made clear that standing between them was not optional, and neither she nor Dylan had argued the point. She wore the blue dress again. It had carried her through the worst day of the previous year, and she had decided it deserved to carry her through the best one too. Dylan stood beside her and said his vows in the same voice he used for everything, even unhurried, meaning every word completely. When the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," Samuel said loudly, "Finally!" and the entire gathering laughed, and Dylan kissed her while she was still smiling, which was exactly the right way. That evening, after people had gone home, and Samuel was asleep, and the ranch was quiet, and the stars over Texas were doing what they always did, burning without apology, filling up the whole enormous dark, she and Dylan sat on the porch together and didn't need to fill the silence. She thought about the evening he'd come up the drive. The dust on every surface of him. The way he'd taken his hat off slow deliberate. The rifle she'd been holding. The way she'd given him water and a meal and one night in the barn, and told herself that was all it was. She thought about Samuel's question in the dark of the barn. Did you ever love someone before? And the silence that had meant everything. What were you running from? She said. When you came up my drive. Really? He was quiet for a moment. Myself mostly, he said. The version of myself I'd become. He looked at the sky. I'd done things I couldn't reconcile with who I thought I was before the war, and I couldn't figure out how to be someone else in the places I'd been those things. So I moved. And here I had to stay still long enough to work, he said. And when I stayed still long enough, I found out I could be someone different. Because you needed someone different, and it turned out I could be him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The ranch breathed around them, the sounds of animals settling the particular quiet of a property that knew it was held. You didn't become someone different, she said. You just stopped running from who you already were. He was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, he said. That sounds better than my version. It's more accurate. You're very certain about things. Always have been. She looked at the stars. It's what kept me alive this past year. That, he said, and stubbornness. Determination. Right, he said. Determination. She felt him smile against the top of her head. She felt the warm, solid presence of him beside her, the man who had fixed her fence and deepened her well and stood between her and everyone who came to take what was hers, who had sat in her kitchen and answered her son's questions, like they mattered, who had said, "And you'll be my last," like it was a fact rather than a sentiment. Evelyn McCall looked out at the land her husband had built, and that she had saved, and that she was going to pass to her son, and she understood something that could not be put in a legal document or a bank payment or a court ruling. She had not just saved a ranch. She had built something that lasted, the kind of thing that doesn't get built in good times, only in the fire of the bad ones, between two people stubborn enough and broken enough and honest enough to choose each other anyway. Dylan McCall had come up her drive looking for somewhere to stop running. He had found instead the one place in the world worth never leaving. And Evelyn Hart. Evelyn McCall had opened the door.